Yeah. Ringo Starkey doesn't really work. Ringo Starr, fabulous.
Oh, it's mine. Oh, I get by. Gonna shove it a long way to go.
It was going to be different from that moment on, but we didn't know it was going to be quite as big. We did not know that.
Ringo Starr may be the most easygoing Beatle, but behind that calm smile lies a sharp, unfiltered musical taste. While he rarely went on public tirades, he wasn't afraid to let the world know which bands rubbed him the wrong way. From pop acts he dismissed as manufactured to rock icons he accused of losing the heart of the music, Ringo's candid opinions shocked fans and fellow musicians alike. Some of his targets were friends, others rivals, but all earned a spot on this surprising list. And you might be stunned to see who made the cut and why. Number 1, the Monkees. It's hard to imagine a band more polarizing to rock purists in the 1960s than the Monkees. Created for a TV show in 1966, the Monkees were openly marketed as a made-for-television pop group, complete with catchy songs and scripted antics. To teenage fans, they were charming, energetic, and relatable. To serious musicians like Ringo Starr, however, they were a carefully packaged product, not a real band. Ringo once quipped that the Monkees were the equivalent of the Marx Brothers, suggesting that they were more comedy act than credible rock outfit. In the post-Beatles world, authenticity was sacred. Bands were expected to write their own songs, play their own instruments, and pay their dues in clubs before climbing the charts. The Monkees initially didn't fit that mold. Many of their early hits were written by professional songwriters and recorded with session musicians. For a drummer like Ringo, who had spent years honing his craft in Liverpool dive bars, this felt like skipping the hard work entirely. But here's where it gets interesting. The Monkees eventually fought to take control of their music, recording albums where they wrote and played everything themselves. By then, though, the manufactured label had stuck, and for Ringo, first impressions were hard to shake. His dismissive comments, while often laced with humor, carried a real frustration about what he saw as the commercialization of rock. The irony: the Monkees' later work, especially albums like Headquarters and Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn and Jones Limited, earned critical respect and showcased genuine talent. Yet, for many musicians of Ringo's generation, the damage was done. To them, the Monkees represented a turning point when image could sell as much as, or more than, raw talent. Number 2, Led Zeppelin. Ringo Starr had a complicated relationship with Led Zeppelin. On one hand, he admired their musicianship. John Bonham was a powerhouse drummer whose technical skill was undeniable. On the other, Ringo wasn't shy about criticizing Zeppelin's approach to rock, particularly their tendency toward overwhelming volume and elaborate jams. He reportedly felt they sometimes sacrificed melody for sheer sonic assault, turning concerts into walls of sound that could drown out nuance. The Beatles had always strived for balance, pushing musical boundaries without losing the core of the song. Zeppelin's extended solos, thunderous riffs, and marathon live performances were thrilling to millions, but could feel self-indulgent to someone like Ringo, who valued tight arrangements and storytelling. It's not all about how loud you can be, he once hinted in an interview, framing it as a philosophy rather than a direct insult. The contrast was stark. Ringo's drumming was about serving the song, leaving space for melody and emotion. Bonham's style, while brilliant, often dominated the soundscape. To Ringo, that risked turning music into a technical showcase rather than an emotional experience. There's also a generational angle here. The Beatles had disbanded before heavy metal and hard rock fully took over the mainstream. For Ringo, Zeppelin's rise symbolized a shift from rock as a cultural unifier to rock as a competitive spectacle, where bigger, louder, and faster often overshadowed songwriting craft. Still, it wasn't pure dislike. Ringo respected Zeppelin's influence and occasionally praised their ability to energize audiences. But he never hid his belief that volume without melody was a dangerous path for rock's future. His critique wasn't just about Zeppelin. It was about protecting the art form from losing its heart. Number 3, the Rolling Stones. On the surface, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were friendly rivals, trading chart-topping singles, sharing stages, and occasionally even songs. But beneath the smiles and mutual respect, There was a quiet undercurrent of competition and the occasional sharp comment. Ringo Starr, in particular, wasn't afraid to poke at the Stones in interviews, sometimes in ways that blurred the line between playful banter and genuine critique. One of his recurring jabs was about the Stones' rough-and-tumble image. While the Beatles evolved from clean-cut pop sensations into boundary-pushing studio innovators, the Stones cultivated a bad boy persona from the very start. Ringo sometimes hinted that this was more calculated than authentic, suggesting that their image was as much marketing as music. It wasn't a dismissal of their talent. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards earned his respect as songwriters, but it was a reminder that image-making wasn't unique to manufactured acts like the Monkees. There were also musical differences. The Beatles prided themselves on constant reinvention, moving from Rubber Soul to Revolver to Sgt. Pepper's with dizzying speed. The Stones, in Ringo's view, leaned heavily on blues and rock and roll roots, sometimes sticking to a formula. He once remarked that while the Beatles could play like the Stones could never play like the Beatles, a cheeky but telling statement about versatility. And yet, this wasn't pure animosity. The two bands genuinely enjoyed each other's company in certain eras, and Ringo could be complimentary, especially about Charlie Watts' understated drumming. But there's no denying that in interviews, he often framed the Beatles as the superior creative force, subtly diminishing the Stones' innovation in comparison. The rivalry fueled both bands, pushing them to greater heights. But for Ringo, the Stones were always the other guys, respected competitors, never equals in artistry. Number 4, the Beach Boys. If there's one rivalry in rock history built almost entirely on mutual admiration, it's the Beatles versus the Beach Boys. But even admiration has its limits, and for Ringo Starr, the boundary between influence and competition was razor-thin. The turning point came in 1966 with the release of Pet Sounds. Brian Wilson's masterpiece stunned the Beatles. Its lush harmonies, innovative arrangements, and emotional depth forced them to rethink what a pop album could be. Paul McCartney openly called it his favorite album of all time, and John Lennon admired its artistic ambition. Ringo, he respected it, but he also bristled at the way critics suddenly declared the Beach Boys as the new kings of pop innovation. To Ringo, Pet Sounds was brilliant, but it wasn't Sgt. Pepper's. He saw the Beatles follow up as the natural evolution of what Pet Sounds started, and, in his mind, the superior achievement. When critics set the two albums against each other, he often pushed back, subtly reminding interviewers that the Beatles weren't reacting to Pet Sounds so much as charting their own creative path. There was also a philosophical difference. The Beach Boys' sound, rooted in California sunshine and layered harmonies, didn't match the cultural bite and experimental edge Ringo prized. To him, their music could sometimes feel too polished, too idyllic, lacking the grit and unpredictability that kept rock exciting. And while he admired Brian Wilson's genius, he didn't hide his view that Wilson's meticulous studio perfectionism could drain the spontaneity out of a performance. Still, Ringo's critique was never venomous. He could praise the Beach Boys' skill while holding firm that the Beatles' blend of melody, experimentation, and cultural impact was unmatched. In his eyes, the Beach Boys were formidable, but the Beatles were in a league of their own. Number 5. Yoko Ono's avant-garde friends. When Ringo Starr expressed skepticism about certain corners of the art world, he wasn't just talking about abstract paintings or cryptic poetry. He was referring to the tight-knit group of avant-garde musicians and performance artists who orbited Yoko Ono during and after her relationship with John Lennon. These were artists who lived to push boundaries, often discarding melody, rhythm, or traditional song structure entirely. For Ringo, a drummer whose instincts were rooted in groove and songcraft, it could be maddening. In the late 1960s and early 70s, John and Yoko immersed themselves in experimental art collectives, bringing home tapes of sound collages, primal screams, and live happenings, where the music was less about notes and more about raw expression. Ringo tried to be open-minded, but privately he admitted that much of it was too far out for his taste. He could appreciate innovation. After all, the Beatles had recorded Revolution 9, but there was a fine line between art and noise, and he felt this scene often leapt over it. The tension wasn't personal animosity toward Yoko's friends. It was a philosophical divide. Ringo saw music as a unifying force, something that could be experimental yet still accessible. The avant-garde crowd seemed almost allergic to accessibility, embracing obscurity as a badge of honor. For him, this risked alienating audiences rather than inspiring them. Yet, in fairness, Ringo respected their conviction. They weren't trying to sell records, they were trying to redefine art. It just wasn't his world. Whenever asked about these figures, he'd give a polite shrug and say something diplomatic, but his lack of enthusiasm was clear between the lines. Takeaway? For Ringo, music could be strange, bold, and daring, but it still needed to reach the listener. Art for art's sake was fine. Art that forgot the audience? Not so much. Number 6, The Byrds. The Byrds burst onto the scene in the mid-1960s with shimmering harmonies and jangling 12-string guitar riffs that made folk music cool again. Their fusion of Bob Dylan's lyrical depth with electric rock instrumentation won them critical acclaim and a loyal following. But Ringo Starr wasn't entirely sold. While he respected their musicianship, he found their blend of folk and rock to be restrained. Part of the issue was philosophical. The Beatles had already proven you could fuse genres. Think Norwegian Wood or Tomorrow Never Knows. But they did so while continually evolving their sound. To Ringo, the Byrds style, though innovative at first, risked becoming formulaic. The layered harmonies and chiming guitars were beautiful, but after a few albums, he felt the innovation had plateaued. There was also the cultural contrast. The Byrds were tied closely to the American folk revival, with lyrics steeped in political and social commentary. Ringo valued that kind of substance, but he preferred it when dressed in more adventurous musical clothing. He saw the Beatles as constantly leaping forward, while the Byrds, in his view, sometimes lingered too long in familiar territory. It didn't help that comparisons between the two bands were common in the press. Journalists loved to pit the Byrds as America's answer to the Beatles, a label Ringo found overstated. To him, they weren't rivals. They were a talented band working in a narrower lane. Still, Ringo admired Roger McGuinn's guitar work and the band's role in bridging folk and rock. His critiques weren't personal attacks, but rather an expression of his belief that rock survival depended on constant reinvention. The Byrds had opened a door, but Ringo expected artists to walk through and keep going, not set up camp just inside. Love him or hate him, Ringo Starr never faked his feelings about music. His dislikes reveal as much about his standards as his hits do about his talent. Which of these surprised you most? Drop your thoughts below, and get ready. Our next deep dive might shock you even more.